And as we think about all the countries that have a nuclear weapon, we have to go back to the 1920s and 30s in Germany. We have to look at the exodus after the Jewish question, escaping famous scientists, Einstein first, Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, Louis Szilard, who persuaded President Roosevelt to create the Manhattan Project. In Germany, there was a much different, fragmented approach. The Wehrmacht, which did rocketry, the Navy, that could launch torpedoes and missiles from secret Unterseebooten, the SS, and, ironically, the Reichspost, the Berlin post office. So you had at least 4 sites of nuclear research. You had Heisenberg and Otto Hahn at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin with outlying facilities in Heckingen. But the real thing that was there was a secret underground secret weapons facility. It was in multiple locations. It was in West Germany, just behind the French border. It was in Bavaria. It was in parts of Germany. And most importantly, Czechoslovakia and Austria. The original beer kellers that kept beer preserved and cool were extended in sandstone and limestone formations and eventually granite formations in the middle of mountains, in mountainous areas underground, and particularly towards the end of the war in an area near Linz, Austria, up down the river from Vienna, the Danube River, Nuremberg, Linz, Vienna, and Melk. There was a concentration camp that we all have heard of called Mauthausen. The area of the underground secret tunnels, which was administered and coordinated by Reich's armament procurement. The SS General, who became an Obergruppenführer, Hans Kammler, Dr. Ing, headed Reich's armament procurement under the SS. On the civilian side, we've all heard of Albert Speer. There's much less publicity about Dr. Ing, as he needed to remain invisible underground. Very few pictures were taken of him. Little was publicized for a good reason. After building air raid shelters in Linz, the Führer Adolf Hitler promoted him with Albert Speer on the civilian side to SS General, and they began and extended these underground tunnels because the Allies could bomb anything above ground. They drilled 200 feet, tens of kilometers deep into rock. And originally they even could launch rockets from such sites. So the kind of the progression for these wonder weapons, secret weapons, started with the V-1 missile, which was launched on a slide, a ramp. The V-2 rocket, which was launched vertically. We all know the after the war story of Operation Paperclip and Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger and others. But eventually, as those sites were bombed, as the Reich started to shrink with the Ring of Steel, the Russians in the east, British in the north, Americans in the southwest, and the French coming and encircling and shrinking that circle of war production, much moved south to the Bavarian Alps, the so-called Alpine Redoubt. Under these fields, but in solid rock, and into these mountains that were fairly inaccessible and very difficult to do aerial photography or reconnaissance of for the Allies. And furthermore, if you built the factories underground, you could take prisoners from a nearby concentration camp, and the political interests, Jewish or not, would prohibit the bombing of a concentration camp. Yet some public figures wanted the concentration camps bombed so more prisoners couldn't be taken there. But the true fact was that was a safe haven. So if you built such a factory underground within a few kilometers and fewer miles from the concentration camp, you could have underground transportation or above ground. The concentration camp made the area relatively safe, and the underground deep tunnel factory laboratory conglomerates could bring Reichsarmament production into a safe haven. This happened since at least 1943, a full 2 years before the end of the war. But at the end of the war, our intelligence, which sought information, and our counterintelligence, which ostensibly prevented information from leaking, both focused on the V-1 and the V-2 rockets. As the ring shrank, it became the America rocket, an advanced form of the V-2, which could actually reach as far as North America from Österreich or Austria. Submarines could reach the shores of America. They, at the end of the war, were potentially able to launch a V-1-like rocket from the deck of a submarine, but they had to be within 40 miles of the coast of New York or Washington, D.C., Baltimore, wherever they wanted to target. But bombers were being developed that could reach America. Some of them hadn't been tested, and none of them had actually flown a mission of war. So you have to imagine America producing things above ground. They weren't worried about being bombed. So production had a head start, even though we were behind when the war broke out in 1939, and for us 1941. When President Roosevelt committed his Army, Navy, and Air Forces of the Army to war, we were behind, but we were able to catch up because we didn't have to build all these underground factories. We could freely manufacture across the broad country. Russia had a similar problem, and they had intelligence and counterintelligence. But as the Wehrmacht advanced to the line of Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, and the Caucasus, they simply moved their factories further east. They could go as far as Siberia. So as the Luftwaffe moved forward with the Wehrmacht, they had to still be behind the advanced elements. Their range got better, but Russians were able to move things back